I have been a ranger in this national park for 8 years. Every tree, every stone, every burrow in this wilderness, I know them all. You could say that I loved the forest, but everything began to change on that seemingly ordinary spring morning. At first, it was a subtle change, barely noticeable. A patch of grass turning sickly yellow, a tree shedding its leaves prematurely, a ring of mold creeping up the bark. I noted it, as was my job, assuming it was just a natural phenomenon, something I hadn't yet encountered in my years here. Perhaps a local disease was making its rounds in the ecosystem. However, as days turned into weeks, the subtle change wasn't so subtle anymore. The disease was spreading rapidly, and part of the forest started to look as if it had been torched. The lush greenery was replaced by a grotesque landscape of withered trees and discolored grass, all coated with a sickly gray mold. Desperate, I collected samples, sending them off to the lab for examination. The forest was crying for help, and I was helpless. The beauty I had known and loved was crumbling before my eyes, replaced by a foreboding, dying landscape. It wasn't long before the lab returned my call with grim news. The mold that had invaded my forest was unknown to science, is a new species, possibly one of the fungal molds potentially dangerous. They asked me to close the park immediately, which I did, a heavy feeling of dread settling in my heart as I locked the gates. I alerted the local authorities too, hoping that with their resources we might find a solution. Now, you have to understand, this was more than just a job for me. This forest was my home, my refuge. It had comforted me in moments of loneliness, offered solace during periods of grief. The thought of it dying was a gut punch, one that left me reeling. Life in the ranger cabin became lonely. The tourists and campers who brought a certain vibrancy to the place were gone, and I was left alone with my thoughts, each day bringing a new onslaught of guilt, helplessness, and frustration. Then, a week after closing the park, the mold began to mutate. The grayish color was now replaced by a chilling red hue that stretched out like blood vessels, covering almost the entire forest. The sight was haunting. The beautiful greens and browns of the woods now masked by an endless pulsating web of crimson. The local wildlife was next. Animals began to die, their bodies mottled with the crimson mold. The sight of a doe lying still, her eyes vacant and her body invaded by the mold, still haunts me. As if things weren't terrible enough, I received news that the lab where I had sent the samples had burned down. The scientists who had done the first tests were dead. My blood ran cold, my hands trembling as I ended the call. It felt like a horror movie, a terrible nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Then, one day, Michael came to see me. He was an old friend, a police officer assigned to this area. The weariness in his eyes mirrored my own, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a grim expression. He told me the scientists who were studying the mold were starting to act strangely, their behavior becoming more aggressive. "The mold's affecting them, Ted," he said, his voice low and grim. "Even with their protective gear, they're getting infected." He paused, looking over his shoulder as if afraid we were being listened to. "And the lab fire, Ted? The first scientists? They went mad. They killed each other." His words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. A shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time, I felt a real sense of fear. Not just for the forest, but for myself. I was living in the epicenter of a nightmare that was far from over. The silence of the evening was punctuated by the distant hooting of an owl. Its mournful cry echoed through the forest, creating an eerie soundtrack to our grim conversation. "What's happening, Mike?" I found myself asking, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Ted," he admitted, his eyes filled with a kind of despair I had never seen before. "But we have to figure it out before it's too late." The night set in, a blanket of stars twinkling in the vast dark expanse above. The crimson mold pulsed under the moonlight, a stark reminder of our grim reality. And for the first time, The solitude of my cabin felt less like comfort and more like isolation. Days turned into a week since Michael's chilling visit, but the grim news he shared seemed to linger in the air. I was restless, my sleep filled with nightmares of rotting trees and red mold that seemed to close in on me. The disease had spread further, consuming everything in its wake. It was as if the forest was hemorrhaging, the red mold stretching out like veins, seeping deeper into the heart of the wilderness. The animals that once frolicked freely were now silent, their bodies rotting under the touch of the crimson invader. The scientists came daily, their eyes hidden behind goggles, their bodies swathed in protective suits. They moved like shadows amidst the scarlet web, collecting samples, their faces grave. Every day, I noticed their numbers dwindling. A couple of them had begun showing signs of aggression, just like Michael had warned. I still remember the day when one of the scientists got into a physical altercation with one of the police officers. It was unlike him. He was usually soft-spoken and mild-mannered. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as he yelled obscenities, his face twisted in a snarl. Eventually, they had to restrain him, his wild screams echoing through the dying forest. More cops began to show up at the scene. Michael was often among them, his face hardened with the grim reality of our predicament. We'd talk sometimes, sharing silent nods of understanding, each of us weighed down by our shared fear. One such day, he pulled me aside, his face graver than usual. "Ted, we need to talk," he said, glancing nervously around. "What is it, Mike?" I asked, feeling a knot of apprehension in my stomach. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "The lab. Those first scientists. They didn't just kill each other. They did things. Horrible things." A chill ran down my spine. "Mike," I said, my voice hoarse. "What are we dealing with here?" "I don't know, Ted," he replied, a note of helplessness in his voice that scared me more than his words. "I don't know." Days turned into nights, and the nights into days. Time seemed to lose meaning in our shared nightmare. The red mold spread like a malicious entity, claiming more lives, turning the lush green forest into a crimson wasteland. I spent most of my time alone in the ranger cabin, watching the forest succumb to the scarlet web. I could almost hear its silent cries, its pleas for salvation. I pulled the shutter closed, turning away from the sight of the dying forest. As I sank into the worn-out armchair, my mind was filled with images of the strange crimson strands consuming everything in their path, the scientists going mad, and Michael's despairing face. The normality of my cabin stood in stark contrast to the bizarre and horrifying world outside, and it made me feel more isolated than ever. I couldn't escape the sinking feeling that whatever was happening was bigger than us, bigger than our little town, and perhaps bigger than we could ever comprehend. The dread that hung in the air was palpable. A month since that first ominous discovery, the mold had swallowed the national park whole and began leaking into the county. It had taken to the air, carried by the winds that swept across our lands, its crimson tendrils visible in the blue of the sky. The transformation of the town was chilling to witness. People had started acting strangely, their actions disjointed and unpredictable. Some appeared to remain normal, going about their daily tasks with an almost desperate adherence to routine. Others, however, had begun displaying aggressive behavior. News of the strange phenomenon had spread beyond our town, drawing media attention from all corners. A state of emergency was declared, the severity of the situation dawning upon everyone. The military rolled in, their uniformed presence offering an illusion of control amidst the chaos. But even they couldn't hide the unease that seemed to emanate from them. And then, the unthinkable happened. Reports of cannibalism started circulating. People I had known for years, good, normal people, had fallen prey to a primal madness. Panic swept through the town. The military initiated an evacuation. The town declared a quarantine zone. Residents were herded onto buses, their faces marked with confusion and fear. I watched as my friends, my neighbors, were driven away, their homes and lives abandoned in the wake of an unfathomable terror. My turn came eventually. A young soldier, no more than a kid really, approached me with hesitance in his eyes. He tried to persuade me to leave, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "Sir, we need to get you out of here. It's not safe." I looked at him, this young man barely out of his teens, thrown into a situation far beyond his comprehension. The forest was my home, my sanctuary. Even in its current horrifying state, it felt more familiar than the prospect of an uncertain refuge. And besides, I couldn't abandon it. Not while I still didn't understand what was happening. "I'm not leaving," I told him, my voice steady. He seemed taken aback but didn't argue further. I had to find out what was causing this, for the sake of the forest, for my town. And so, under the cover of darkness, I slipped into the forest. The once familiar terrain was a stranger now, red tendrils weaving a dense tapestry around me. The air was heavy, pregnant with a metallic tang that stuck in the back of my throat. I moved with caution, my senses on high alert. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the distant crackling of mold-ridden branches, a chilling reminder of the corruption. An inexplicable fear gnawed at me, and yet, a sense of morbid curiosity pushed me forward. As I ventured further, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the pulsating heart of the forest and the all-consuming silence. My mind kept drifting back to Michael, his grim prediction looping in my head. I wondered if he'd been right, if we were too late to save ourselves from this horrifying calamity. As the forest swallowed me whole, the silence was shattered by a sudden sound, a terrifying, inhuman shriek that reverberated through the air. I froze in my tracks, my blood running cold. A sense of dread washed over me, stronger than ever. This was the sound of despair, of a world surrendering to an insidious invader. I could do nothing but listen, my heart hammering in my chest as the wail echoed through the crimson forest. As the cry died away, the silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. But there was no peace in this quiet, no solace. It was the silence of an ending, of a world plunging into chaos. Leaning against a tree trunk, I sank to the ground, overcome by despair. I looked at the crimson tendrils weaving their way up the bark, their pulsing life a grotesque parody of the life that once flourished here. As the weight of the situation pressed down on me, I wondered if this was the end, if this was where we had arrived in our journey. My every step echoed the bone-crunching sounds that haunted my dreams, an eerie soundtrack to the horror playing out before me. All around, rotting carcasses of animals lay scattered, their bodies overrun by the invasive mold. Each sight was a chilling reminder of the devastation that had befallen my beloved sanctuary. The rustling of the undergrowth and the occasional chilling sound kept my nerves on edge. Night fell, bringing with it a new kind of horror. As darkness swallowed the last remnants of the day, I noticed movement in the periphery of my vision. A deer, half rotten and covered in the relentless mold, staggered from the undergrowth. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, the same luminescent red that covered the forest. It moved with a stiffness that defied nature, its legs bending and creaking in ways that echoed the bone-cracking sounds that haunted the night. It was a grotesque puppet, manipulated by an unseen sinister force. I recoiled in horror, backing away from the unholy sight. The creature paid me no mind, continuing its jerky, disconcerting movements. I took refuge in a nearby cave, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was no longer recognizable, the familiar landscapes and sounds replaced by this alien, menacing world. As the night wore on, My only company was the echo of my own heartbeat and the bone-cracking sounds emanating from the forest. The cave provided little comfort, the cold stone beneath me a harsh contrast to the soft forest floor I'd known. Without warning, the deafening roar of a bear shattered the stillness. My heart leaped into my throat, my blood running cold. The roar sounded again, closer this time, sending chills down my spine. I emerged from the cave, peering into the darkness. A hulking silhouette emerged from the shadows, a bear covered in the same crimson mold that plagued the forest. Its flesh was torn and rotting, revealing exposed bones and muscle, yet it moved with a predatory grace that belied its decayed state. I could only watch, frozen in terror, as it moved closer. Its eyes glowed with the same unnatural light, its roar echoing the bone-cracking sounds that had become the forest's haunting lullaby. In a split second, the bear lunged, its powerful body propelling it towards me. I barely managed to scramble away, the sight of its rotting flesh, pulsating with the glow of the mold, imprinted on my mind. With a last glance at the monstrous bear, I bolted, my heart hammering against my chest. Behind me, the bear roared, the sound reverberating through the night. I didn't stop, my desire for survival propelling me forward. When the first rays of dawn broke through the canopy, I found myself huddled against a tree trunk, the cave a distant memory. My body was a symphony of aches, my mind still reeling from the nightmarish events. But as the new day dawned, I was still alive, still fighting. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows in the crimson forest, I pushed myself up, shaking off the despair that had begun to settle in. I felt like a stranger in my own world, lost and disoriented in the forest I had once known like the back of my hand. A few yards away I saw something that made my heart sink. A cluster of bodies, half buried in a thick tangle of mold. I walked closer, my throat constricting as I recognized the uniforms. They were the scientists, their bodies now part of the grotesque tapestry woven by the mold. Beside them, there was another figure. The sight of him hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Michael, his face barely recognizable beneath the suffocating mold. He, too, was ensnared in the fungal web, his eyes open but empty, the light in them extinguished. Something primal in me rebelled at the sight, a visceral rejection of this unnatural state. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the crimson mold that encased him. The mold was warm and pulsating, the texture vile under my fingertips. As I began to peel away the mold, something unbelievable happened. Michael's hand moved. His grip closed around my wrist with surprising strength, the touch cold and lifeless, yet undeniably firm. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. His eyes shifted to meet mine, the unnatural red glow within them chilling me to my core. When he spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper, each word seeming to take an immense effort. "You're a sinner," he rasped, his grip tightening around my wrist. "You will go to hell." The words hung in the air between us, a harsh verdict from a judge no longer entirely human. But it was the last thing he said that sent chills down my spine. I am chosen by God. As he finished speaking, his mouth opened unnaturally wide, and he let out a sound that shook me to my core. The bone-cracking noise that echoed throughout the forest, an anthem of the horror that had taken over our world. The air around us seemed to vibrate with the horrific sound, and then, as if triggered by some unseen cue, the other bodies entangled in the mold echoed the sound, their mouths opening in silent screams. The forest around us was filled with the terrifying chorus, the bone-cracking sounds reaching a deafening crescendo. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw the bear, the same rotting monstrosity I had encountered the previous night. A surge of adrenaline ripped through me, and I yanked my hand free from Michael's grasp and ran. The bear gave chase, its roars mixing with the cacophony of sounds from the forest. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the chilling symphony of the forest fueling my fear. The nightmare that had once been my sanctuary had twisted into a macabre puppet show, with me as the unwilling protagonist. I ran, every sound, every movement sending fresh waves of terror through me. Despite my exhaustion and the rising fear, I managed to outpace the bear. Its roaring eventually became fainter, the sight of its grotesque figure lost in the twisting scarlet pathways behind me. As I ran, a panorama of horror unfolded around me. Scenes of unimaginable chaos as the forest and its inhabitants were consumed by madness. A stag, its antlers dripping with the scarlet mold, gnawed on the corpse of another deer. A group of scientists I vaguely recognized, their protective suits torn and covered in the red tendrils, feasted on the remains of a wolf. Every grotesque image seared into my mind, each tableau of terror serving to drive home the abominable reality I was living. Eventually, I saw an ominous shape on the horizon, a small mountain jutting out of the forest, its peak lost in the blood-colored haze. I steered towards it, desperate for a moment of respite. A thick crimson root sprawled from its base, disappearing into the mouth of a cave. Hesitant but desperate, I descended into the depths of the cave. My flashlight revealed a haunting spectacle, the bodies of more scientists and policemen, torn apart and caught in the fungal network. I felt a lump form in my throat. As I ventured deeper into the cave, my flashlight illuminated something extraordinary. A pulsating, square object embedded in the cavern wall. It throbbed rhythmically, a glowing red heart in the belly of this beast of a forest. I instinctively knew this was the source, the heart of the monstrous fungus that had claimed everything I held dear. I approached it cautiously, my senses on high alert. As I reached out to touch it, a sudden dread washed over me. It pulsed under my touch, the rhythm quickening. Without thinking, I struck it with all my strength, the desperation and rage finally finding an outlet. But instead of shattering or recoiling, the object burst into a bright scarlet light. I was blinded, forced to shield my eyes from the harsh light. An agonizing moment passed before the light faded, and I dared to open my eyes again. The square object had vanished. The pulsating heart of the forest was gone, leaving only an empty spot on the cave wall. I felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with apprehension. Had I done the right thing? Only time would tell. The exit of the cave seemed like a rebirth, the muted sunlight a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness I had left behind. My heart pounded as I re-entered the world, bracing for the madness that awaited. I emerged to a sight more horrifying than anything I had encountered thus far. My hometown, the place I had grown up in, had been set ablaze. The flames danced against the backdrop of the infected forest, a fiery carnival of destruction. The military, supposed guardians of order, were embroiled in a bloody battle among themselves, their sanity lost to the scarlet tendrils. My home, my town, consumed by flames and madness. I felt like I was standing at the edge of an abyss, the familiar world crumbling under my feet. Through the chaos, I managed to slip away unnoticed, my heart heavy as I navigated the nightmarish scenes playing out around me. I arrived at my house, its structure untouched, but its soul tainted by the spreading madness. As I stepped in, the silence inside felt deafening, an island of calm amidst the storm. I found my old radio set, the static humming a strange comfort. As I fiddled with the dials, a frantic voice cut through the static. It was a news report, but the words that fell on my ears only served to deepen my despair. The unknown fungal outbreak has been traced to the appearance of unidentified square objects around the world. The world was falling apart, descending into chaos as the fungus spread its insidious tendrils far and wide. It was a global calamity, a cataclysmic event that had pushed humanity to the edge of extinction. I closed my eyes, trying to drown out the steady hum of the broadcast. The silence within me was broken by a harsh realization. The world as I knew it was doomed. I was alone, stranded amidst the echoes of a life that was no more, and a world on the brink of oblivion. The forest I had fought to protect, The town I had called home, the people I had once shared laughs and beers with, all were now just distant memories, fading echoes of a world that was rapidly disintegrating. As I sat there in the deafening silence of my house, one thing became painfully clear. I was no longer the ranger in a quaint national park. I was now just another survivor in a dying world. Endless pine trees towered over me, their eternal watchmen of the woods standing sentinel as I walked the familiar trails of the park. My boots crunched in rhythm on the undergrowth, whispering their solitary song to the dappled shade of the forest. The scent of earth, pine, and the distant hint of a looming storm filled my lungs. It was just another day in the life of a park ranger, a path I'd chosen because of the quiet solitude and the profound connection with nature that it offered. "Ranger Mike, come in," the radio crackled, ripping me from my thoughts. It was Lydia, my colleague who handled the operations from our station at the park's edge. "Mike here. What's up, Lydia?" I responded, thumb pressed on the talk button. "Got a hiker complaining about some animal bones they found on Trail 6. Can you check it out?" "Copy that, Lydia. I'm on my way." Trail 6 was a winding path on the east side of the park, known for its challenging terrain and the breathtaking views it offered. As I neared the reported site, the wind began to blow, rustling the leaves overhead and making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Unsettled, I shook it off. Nature, in all its beauty, also had a darker side. It didn't take long to find what the hiker had reported. A pile of bones, disarrayed and partially covered in foliage, lay in a secluded spot off the trail. I crouched down, eyes scanning the skeletal remains. They were not just the remnants of some woodland creature. Mixed in with the typical deer and rabbit bones were others, larger, unfamiliar. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision had me standing up abruptly. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. It was as though the woods themselves had suddenly come alive, their breath on my neck, their eyes on my back. Tucking the unfamiliar bones into a bag, I decided to bring them back to the ranger station for further investigation. The walk back was oddly eerie, the once familiar sounds of the forest now seeming strange and ominous. Each crackle of a twig underfoot echoed loudly in my ears. Each rustle of leaves made my heart pound. Back at the ranger station, I spread the bones out on a table, attempting to arrange them into some semblance of order. My gaze kept being drawn to the strange bones, larger and oddly shaped, nothing like I'd ever seen before. I wasn't a forensic expert, but even my untrained eyes could tell that they were almost human. Yet, they were grotesquely elongated, as if they belonged to a human who'd been stretched on a medieval torture rack. "Those some kind of bear bones, Mike?" Lydia asked, breaking into my thoughts as she walked in. I don't think so," I confessed, my gaze fixated on the mysterious remains. "I'll tell you what they are," she said, a teasing glint in her eyes. "Vampire bones, or maybe a human bat, like in those old horror films." We both laughed at that, the absurdity of the idea momentarily relieving the tension. But as I looked back at the bones, my laughter died in my throat. I knew then that I had to find the rest of the skeleton, to understand the story these bones were trying to tell, and perhaps to face whatever it was that was watching me from the shadows. As night fell, I found myself back at the discovery site, armed with a flashlight and a chilling sense of anticipation. Moonlight seeped through the canopy above, casting long, gnarled shadows that twisted and swayed with the gentle breeze. My flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam dancing over ferns and old roots, bouncing off rocks and prying into the night's dark corners. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a countdown to something I couldn't yet comprehend. The silence was deafening, the night sounds muted, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Suddenly there was a loud snap from behind, a noise that echoed in the stillness. I whipped around, my breath hitched in my chest. A moment of panic coursed through my veins before I found the source, a fallen branch under the weight of a raccoon scurrying away. Sighing in relief, I turned my attention back to the task at hand. I methodically started searching the surrounding area, the thrill of discovery spurring me on despite the unease. Hours passed, and I unearthed more bones, each as unusual as the last. The skeleton they were forming was becoming clearer, a strange, monstrous mix of human and beast. Each piece of the puzzle added a new level of dread, a fear of the unknown entity I was uncovering. Yet that was when I heard it again, a crackle of undergrowth, the distinct rustle of movement, and that oppressive feeling of being watched. I stood still, a half-dug bone gripped tightly in my hand as I surveyed the forest around me. My flashlight swept across the trees, their bark appearing ghostly white in the artificial light. My eyes strained in the darkness, my breath shallow. There was nothing. No eyes reflecting the light, no movement to be seen. Only the ancient woods and their secrets stood before me. I shuddered, a sudden cold washing over me despite the summer night. Shaking off the feeling, I packed up the newly found bones and made my way back to the station, the feeling of unseen eyes burning into my back as I left. The following morning, I awoke to a low-hanging fog, the dense cloud of mist weaving its ghostly tendrils between the trees. An unearthly silence pervaded the park, only disrupted by the occasional cawing of crows. My dreams had been plagued by the skeletal figure we were slowly piecing together back at the station, its phantom image lingering in my mind. Dragging myself out of bed, I went about my morning routine, the usual tranquility replaced by an unsettling apprehension. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but glance towards the ranger station where the bones awaited further investigation. I decided to pay a visit to the local university that day. I wanted to share my findings with the anthropology department, hoping they could shed some light on the mysterious bones. As I walked through the austere corridors, the smell of old books and floor wax filling the air, I felt the comfort of familiarity return. I used to be a regular here during my training days, always eager to learn more about nature's hidden secrets. Professor Laura Hastings, the head of the department, was an old friend. A stern woman with a sharp intellect, Laura had a keen interest in anomalies, the unknown creatures that occasionally graced our world. I trusted her judgment, and more importantly, her discretion. "Mike," Laura greeted me warmly, "what brings you here?" With a deep breath, I presented the collection of bones to her. Laura's eyes lit up, and she went silent as she examined them. Her fingers traced the abnormal curves, her expression growing more perplexed with each bone she held. These are incredible, Mike," Laura whispered, seemingly lost in thought. "I've never seen anything quite like this." Just hearing her echo my thoughts brought a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just me. These bones were unusual, possibly unheard of. Laura promised to run some tests, promising to keep the discovery confidential until we had more answers. I thanked her, feeling the burden of the mystery slightly alleviated. Returning to the park, my attention was brought back to the task at hand. There were more bones out there, and I needed to find them. The park seemed even more eerie in the encroaching twilight. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, haunting shadows that stretched out like dark fingers across the landscape. Once again, I found myself at the original discovery site, this time accompanied by an uncanny silence. I began my search, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The woods were hushed, every rustle of the leaves underfoot sounding like a thunderclap in the quiet. As I dug into the earth, the darkness around me felt denser. An overwhelming feeling of being watched resurfaced, the unseen observer from before seemingly closer. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, an instinctive reaction to the unseen danger. I was about to retreat when my shovel hit something solid. I reached down and pulled it out, holding it up to the light. Another bone, larger this time, possibly part of a ribcage. My hands shook as I held it, a sense of dread washing over me. I hastily gathered the rest of the bones and retreated back to the safety of the station, my mind racing with unspoken fears. That night, as I tossed and turned in bed, a thought plagued me. The feeling of being watched wasn't simply a feeling. There was something out there, a guardian of the bones perhaps, silently observing, waiting. The mystery deepened, drawing me in with its cold, skeletal hand. Days turned into weeks, and the pile of bones at the ranger station grew, each new discovery revealing more of the terrifying creature they once belonged to. Laura's updates from the university were infrequent and inconclusive. She was as baffled as I was. The creature defied classification. She'd confirmed my initial suspicions. The bones were almost human, but with a skeletal structure that was a grotesque exaggeration of our own. The unknown creature was taller, leaner, and had elongated bones suggesting wings, like a bat's. Despite the growing terror, a perverse curiosity gripped me. I needed to assemble this skeleton, to understand what it was. Each day I returned to the forest, braving the sensation of being watched, uncovering more of this unknown entity piece by piece. One night, as I delved deeper into the forest, my flashlight caught the opening of a cave, half hidden by undergrowth and shadow. I was sure I had never seen it before. The cave beckoned me, an unspoken promise of untold secrets hanging in the air. With a deep breath, I ventured inside, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the damp stone walls. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, branching into winding tunnels that were shrouded in darkness. A chill ran down my spine, the cold air seeming to seep into my very bones. The silence within the cave was almost oppressive, as if the cave itself was holding its breath, waiting. I proceeded deeper, my senses on high alert. I paused as my light caught a glint in the corner. Approaching it, I realized with a jolt of shock that it was a bone, larger than any I'd found so far. It was nestled in a recess in the cave wall, as if it had been placed there deliberately. I was bent on retrieving the bone when a shuffling noise echoed from the depths of the cave. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. A sudden gust of wind howled through the cave, the eerie sound amplifying my fear. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I sensed an oppressive presence growing nearer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't alone in this cave. Adrenaline coursed through me as I picked up the bone and retreated hastily. As I emerged from the cave, I cast a final glance back into the darkness. Was that a pair of eyes reflecting my flashlight, or merely my imagination playing tricks on me? I made my way back to the station, my mind a whirlwind of terror and curiosity. But as the safety of the station lights grew closer, I realized what I had to do. The creature, whatever it was no ordinary beast. It was something otherworldly, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The bones were not just remains. They were a part of this creature's story, a story that was deeply ingrained within the fabric of these woods. Driven by a sense of respect, perhaps even fear, I made a decision. Over the following days, I painstakingly transported the collected bones to the cave, placing each one carefully within its quiet confines. The process was terrifying, the feeling of being watched never leaving me for a moment. But it also felt strangely right, as if I was restoring balance to a world I had unknowingly disrupted. As I placed the final bone in the cave, a sense of relief washed over me. Perhaps I'd finally appeased the unseen watcher. Perhaps the bones could rest undisturbed now. I stepped out of the cave, leaving the mysteries of the bones behind me. As I made my way back to the station, the forest seemed different, less menacing. The oppressive sensation of being watched had lessened, replaced with an almost palpable calm. The moon cast its soft glow on the winding trail, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. Arriving back at the station, I reported to Lydia about the cave, choosing to keep the bones' final resting place a secret. I merely told her that I didn't find any more bones, and that maybe the creature was just a strange anomaly. She nodded, clearly relieved that the ordeal was over. That night, sleep came easily. My dreams were no longer haunted by skeletal figures and phantom eyes. Instead, I dreamt of the forest, its peaceful serenity restored. When I woke, the first light of dawn was peeking through my window, casting a warm, soft glow across the room. The park seemed almost welcoming, the once foreboding trees standing tall and resolute in the morning light. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal. My routine resumed its predictable pattern, and the bones became nothing more than a chilling memory. The park seemed to have accepted me again, the sensation of being watched fading away into a mere whisper on the wind. Yet, I never forgot. The cave remained, a silent reminder of the unknown, of the eerie creature that was now at peace. I avoided it during my patrols, a silent agreement between the guardian of the woods and myself.